Hello everyone, and in this video I'll be showing you how I turn some raw, wild, natural clay into some refined and very plastic earthenware clay. As you can see here, as I move it in my hands, it's quite nice. So to start things off, I have here my bag of unprocessed wild clay and some buckets that I have over here on the side. This process I'll be using is essentially the wet process as opposed to the dry process. So to start things off, I'm going to be filling up this bucket with water, and while that's filling up, you might be wondering where to find raw wild clay. Well, simply put, I would look for soil or ground that looks like this, all crackled up. That just shows that the clay in the soil has contracted as it dried. Of course, it has to be dry for you to see that. But I feel like that is a topic for a separate video. I would highly recommend looking at YouTuber Andy Ward's Ancient Pottery. I learned a lot from him, and he has a lot of good videos there about pottery making and showing you how and where to find these natural and wild clays. So let's just let this bucket fill up. There you go. So here I'm going to start adding my raw, wild, unprocessed clay into the water. Keep in mind that this unrefined clay is dry at this state. If it was wet, it would be a little bit harder to mix in later. There, just add the last bits. And here now, I just have a small stick that I'm going to use to stir up the water and the clay, get it mixed up quite well. It's important that you mix the clay as much as possible here. Make sure you get as much of those clay particles suspended in the water. Now that that's all mixed up, I have now a second bucket, which is over here, as well as a mesh strainer. I just got this one from the grocery store, normal food strainer. So here I'm just going to pour the suspended clay and water through the strainer. This will just help remove any larger particles and any organic material that might be floating in the water. You can see there's quite a bit in there. It's also important to note that I did let the mixed up clay water in the bucket kind of settle a little bit, but not too long, just to get most of the heavy particles out by letting them settle to the bottom. So as you can see here, I'm just removing this strainer with all the junk and crud that goes into the trash. And this is what's left in the bucket. There's still some clay in there and lots of rocks. So I will actually be putting this through a second wash and using a second bucket to let that settle out. As you can see here, this is the second wash. You may have to do this with your clay. Depends how much clay you have or how much clay you added into the water, but that depends. And here is the second straining. So I like to strain my clay twice, just in case I missed any large particles or organics in there. So here I have a time lapse of the clay settling out of the water. This is over the course of around 30 minutes to an hour. So after the clay is settled, I carefully pour off the top layer of clean water for the most part. And I'm being careful here not to spill over any of that clay at the bottom. So as you can see here, being quite careful. And I kind of just wait until just a little bit of clay comes over and then I stop. Just to make sure I get out as much of that clear water as possible. And as you can see here, how much clear water and clay is left in the bucket. So here, for the straining process, this is now going to really refine the clay, get a lot of that water out. I'm just using a cotton shirt. I found that cotton works quite well, especially if the weave is pretty dense. And I'm just putting that over a bucket along with some clothespins. Make sure the shirt doesn't fall into the bucket all the way from the weight of the water and clay. I found that that could be a problem if you really don't anchor the shirt well, so I'd recommend using a good amount of clothespins here. It just so happens that this is the same bucket with the excess rocks and crud from the clay. Figured I might just use it. So here's our clay water. Just swirling it up. I usually don't do this because you can let the heavier particles settle out and really just pour off the top, but I wanted to get more material out of this, and I figured the natural temper, which I'll get into later, will help in the drying and firing of the clay. And here is the second bucket from the second rinse of the raw unrefined clay. So after letting the clay strain out for a few days, ideally you would put it under the sun when it's solid enough. That way it would dry a little faster. Unfortunately, it was raining at the time, so instead of putting it on the sun, I just put it on my countertop with a fan to help it dry out a lot faster. And as you can see here, the clay is starting to become quite malleable and plastic. You can judge whether or not it's workable enough or dry enough just by poking at it, seeing if it's a little too wet or even a little too dry. You can add a little water back in. So here is the final result. I would recommend kneading it a little bit, mixing it together, make sure there's no wet spots or dry spots. But yeah, that is the finished clay. So after that, I basically just stored it in some plastic to help prevent it from drying out. And in this portion, I will be mixing in the temper. Now, what is temper? Well, temper is essentially a non-plastic material, such as sand or volcanic ash, that will help the clay dry, or rather shrink evenly, and it helps prevent cracking in both the drying process and the firing process. So my ratio of temper to clay in this case will be a 1:4 ratio, and the temper I'll be using here is silica sand that I got online. Now, how I measure this ratio is I essentially try to mold the clay into an even patty, I suppose, and I essentially will draw two lines, sort of like a cross. You'll see it right here. And sort of divide the clay body into four. So there, now I will be removing 1/4 of this clay body. It doesn't have to be super exact, this is just a good estimate. And it turns out that it works out pretty well. So now here I remove that 1/4, put that off to the side. And I have here my little tub of silica sand. The size of the grains of the sand can, I guess, depend. I would recommend a finer grain, perhaps even finer than this, because when the clay starts to shrink, you will get a sort of rough surface as the sand starts to poke through the clay. That can be mitigated by burnishing, but having a finer sand will really help get that smooth finish to your pottery. You can also do a lot more detailed work with a finer temper. But for my purposes, the size of this grain is perfectly fine. So here I get that 1/4 and I put it back with the rest of the clay. Remember, I'm not removing that 1/4 from the clay. I want the ratio to be a 1:4 of temper to clay. So here I just try to knead in the sand as best as I can. This is actually quite a hard process, which is why I'm speeding up the footage and cutting some bits out, because this takes quite some time. You really have to make sure you mix in the sand as evenly as possible. You don't want pockets of unmixed sand in your clay. So even when all the clay, or rather all the sand, has been absorbed by the clay, you want to continue kneading that clay body to make sure the sand is distributed all throughout as evenly as possible. And pretty much that's it. This clay is now usable for making pottery. Of course, this video is just a part 1. There will be a part 2 of making some pottery with this clay, but here is the final product. A lump of mud, essentially, but it's mud that you can use for making pottery. So in the upcoming video, the part 2 of this, we will be making some stuff with this. I'll be going through the making of the pottery, as you can see here, the firing, and the finished product. So stick around for that. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.